to engage in abuse of power, silencing their critics, and weakening or even shutting down important institutions. The decline in democracy means the lack of accountable governments, resulting in an increase of corruption, gross violation of human rights, and even conflict. Like poverty, hunger, and climate emergency are key factors to take in consideration for our way of living. The rise of autocracy has a consequence that is no other than citizens suffering. There is no doubt that the pandemic has brought a range of new challenges, but nothing compares, in my opinion, to the difficult challenge that is safeguarding the human rights to democracy for all humankind. Authoritarians are taking advantages of different crises to leverage populist movements and to seize power. Once in office, they have begun a process of dismantling very important institutions designed to check their authority and protect human rights, particularly the media and the judiciary. In fact, in the last 5 years, UNESCO has recorded more than 400 killings of journalists worldwide. Almost 9 out of 10 of these killings has gone unpunished. This is just an example of how freedom of expression, including press freedom, is under attack. Because authoritarians cannot control the population if ideas, opinions, news are circulating freely. This is a risk to the only view approach that those on top would like to impose to the rest of the citizens. By limiting newspaper circulation, limiting independent questioning at press conferences, to the stream of persecution and even arrest and killing journalists, the population of a country ends listening to one voice, watching one opinion, and at the end having one view. But you will think that nowadays, with the increase of power of social media, that listening, watching, and reading, controlling that from the population must be extremely difficult. But there is another way: disinformation. With the lockdowns, people were relying more on the internet to communicate and get informed. Yet, a report from Facebook, published last year, revealed that they have uncovered disinformation campaigns in more than 50 countries. Top countries in this report were Russia, China, and Iran, where coordinated networks of accounts, pages, and groups disseminated fake news through fake accounts and misleading information on different topics. They might not be able to control what people read, listen, or watch, but they make sure there are enough fake news or fake information that no one really knows what to believe then. In the year leading to the US election in 2020, the report stated that Facebook discovered more than a dozen coordinated, what they call inauthentic behavior operations coming from the same countries, Russia, China, and Iran. And Facebook removed 5 disinformation networks in each country. Maybe not enough. And that's why US intelligence was very concerned of the involvement of Russia, China, and Iran in their own elections. There is no coincidence that China and Russia share a trait common to authoritarian regimes. Both subordinate the rule of law to their interests of top leaders, both violate basic human rights, and both use repressive tactics to silence critics, and in both countries, there are no free and fair elections. Let's take the case of Russia. In the case of Russia, a new constitution has been adopted in July of 2020 that was adjusted not only the relation between government bodies, codified several popular welfare measures, but most importantly, extended President Vladimir Putin's eligibility to remain in office until 2036. A common interpretation of these reforms is that it's just a way of Putin maintaining his personal power over the country. Others were using an argument that it was more about the keeping centralized power into a strong leader rather than internal competition and the emerge of weak leaders. But however, it remains clear that the Russians are very much confident on maintaining hold of power when they arrested Alex Navalny, a strong critic of the Kremlin, and he was thrown in jail after long rallies and a strong popular support because it was a threat to Putin's rule. In addition, brutal crackdowns to dissidents and has grown dramatically in Russia because of the economic stagnation of the country. These actually make the political elite concerned. It's one of the reasons behind Russia's stop to NATO expansion near his border. Something what Vladimir Putin calls the sphere of influence, meaning that it's not possible to allow a former Soviet Union colony like Ukraine to be a strong, independent country. More importantly, democratic. That is the main concern. Because if Ukraine proves that a democratic, successful, a developing country that is able to be part of the NATO alliance and also part of the European Union, it can prove false that Russia's argument that democracy is not working. In the case of China, the Chinese Communist Party has a monopoly on the power since Mao Zedong led the party and defeated the national rivals and created, pretty much founded the People's Republic of China in 1949. For more than 73 years, one party, one vision, one rule have been the approach to govern in China. But since coming to power in 2012, Xi Jinping has consolidated control over the party. He has been able to end the presidential term limits and creating himself a path for him to rule indefinitely in China. Economic inequality, the climate crisis, and tensions with neighboring countries, including India and Japan, is making Jinping realize that Taiwan, that vibrant democratic state, is a threat actually to China's power. In fact, both countries, in a joint statement during this year Winter Olympics, said that they are going to work together to, quote, revise aspects of the international order, end of the quote. In other words, Russia and China announced a bid to make the world safer for authoritarians. In fact, it's unprecedented how authoritarians are supporting each other across the world. We see it in different countries like Belarus, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Myanmar, where financial assistance, military exchange, support in how to deal with sanctions from the West have created even coalitions at the United Nations to avoid sanctions and accountability. Even furthermore, at the United Human Rights Council, these countries are actually part of this council, and they avoid accountability and even deny any human rights violations. Last December, 3 countries across the world decided to unite and create a strong front against the rise of authoritarianism and protect the human right to democracy. For the first time in decades, we saw the first Summit for Democracy, hosted by the United States and brought more than 100 countries, all together bolstering about how they can defend democracy. And they talk about very specific points. Defending independent media, defending free and fair elections, advancing civil and political leadership of women and girls, and protecting technology and promoting a renewal of democracy. Interesting enough, these are the same rights that we see in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the Civil Political Covenant at international law, proving that the right to democracy is part of the human rights system. This summit was the first step towards consolidating among the international community the responsibility to protect the human right to democracy at a global scale. However, it had been proven not sufficient. Just a few months later, we had seen now leaders of Europe, the US, Canada, and the UK preparing for war. They are doing their best diplomatic efforts to constrain both Russia from attacking Ukraine and China from attacking Taiwan. We are living in very difficult times. Actually, as we speak, members of the European Union are trying to work together to try to convince Vladimir Putin to stop a war in the Western Hemisphere. This can take catastrophic consequences. And all this because authoritarianism has rights to a never seen before levels. The international global order, as we know it, based on clear set of rules and values set up in the Charter of the United Nations and across the international law that we have been developed over decades, is now under pressure. Indeed, it was right for President Biden to talk about democracy in a security conference, because today the security of our way of living is at stake. We as citizens have a role to play. As students at the University of Nirma, as students of law, we have a responsibility to promote the concept of Universal Declaration of Human Rights as an international law, because the rights and freedoms entrenched in this document are necessary and essential to achieve prosperity and ultimately happiness. We all can do our best to keep our world safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was a wonderful insight on the range of issues covering human rights and democracy. And particularly today, when we talk about the movement that is plaguing the world, where we are transitioning into this state of authoritarianism, we have many questions, we have many actors at the international level who are either trying to curb the same or trying to help in moving from democracy to authoritarianism. And you gave a very pertinent example of Facebook, that how it tried to stop Russia, China, and Iran from the inauthenticated user. Which brings me to one of the questions that do you think that these intermediaries, these social media platforms, are somewhere or the other helping the societies to change from democracy to authoritarianism, where there is a lack of liberty and there is a kind of a change in the political ideologies, because they are a medium where the major citizens are relied upon? So don't you think that intermediaries, Facebook, Twitter in particular, and if I talk about the position currently in India, we see there is a political unrest against the ruling government, which is the democracy basically that India follows. So how would you comment upon the same?
Excellent question, and I agree. Facebook, from Facebook to WhatsApp to Instagram to even TikTok these days, all social media platforms have a responsibility to promote um, and to protect information, verifiable information, because that's one of aspects of protecting democracy. If we don't have freedom of expression and we don't have real news, then it's easy to deviate people to these conspiracy theories that we see in the US and in Canada, that we see also here in Europe, especially with the pandemic. We've been seeing a growth of those across here in this part of the world. And it's important for them, to these companies, that they have a responsibility also. It's what they call in international human rights law, business and human rights. They have a responsibility, business have a responsibility, and particularly these businesses, Facebook and these companies, they have a responsibility to make sure that in their platforms, the information can be verifiable, that they stop disinformation campaigns, that they stop fake news from spreading, and also stop these fake accounts that we're seeing growing and growing in different parts of the world, that they are sending mixed signals and also disinformation in different topics. And particularly with COVID-19 has been very dramatic, because we've seen it having an effect globally. Just to give you an example, right now in Canada, there is this protest in front of the parliament for almost 11 days. These truckers have brought their trucks and completely blockade the entire city. And they are asking for stop mandates, stop the vaccines. They're against all this. And what it was based on a Facebook group. They created a Facebook group, they organized that way, and they spread misinformation. And now they're paralyzing Canadians' democracy. And you will think a country like Canada, that is a strong country, part of the G7 countries, is being now stopped because of that misinformation that can be spread through social media. So we all need to be very, very aware. And I agree with you in your question about the importance of or the role they play to protect also democracy. Hope I answer your question.
Yes, absolutely, sir. There is this one report that I was going through recently, that is a report on by the IDEA, that we have this Institution for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, which said in its Global State of Democracy report of 2021 that there are 20 countries which have moved in the past year from democracy to authoritarianism, as compared to the 7 countries which have moved to democracy. So you can see the negative trend, and we all have the reasons in the form of pandemic. So how would you comment on the negative trend, that the world should be appreciating the human rights angle, should be appreciating those various international treaties and the protocols, but we are seeing a negative trend over here? So how would you comment on that?
Excellent point. And of course, IDEA, this organization in Stockholm, has provided a lot of reports. And again, it's very important for these NGOs, international NGOs, to continue reporting on this unfortunately terrible trend, when we see more countries going on the path of authoritarianism, the path of restricting rights, blocking or pretty much violating human rights, basic human rights. So we're seeing more of that trend happening. And now these in 2020, since 2020, since the pandemic, we're seeing even worse, because of course, many governments are taking the opportunity to pretty much just have a very strong hold on society based on the restrictions. Of course, we have to stay at home, we have to wear a mask, we have to avoid crowds, but at the same time, that also allows for government to actually expand on that and then take advantage of the fact that they can say, okay, no more protests. You cannot go outside and protest. You cannot you cannot promote free ideas, because this is what we want you to say. So we're living in very difficult times, and that's why you see that trend going, more countries going on that path. That's why it's so important to defend the fundamental rights that we've seen in the international human rights system. Normally point and shame, that's something that as a strategy to point and shame those countries that are not following the international law, but at the same time have events like this where we can discuss freely this trend. On this particular idea, at least on this NGO idea report, is definitely frightening when we see more countries going on that path. And I believe that the Summit of Democracy hosted by the United States, and then it's going to be another one very, very soon, is very important path. It's an important step towards building that coalition of countries that can defend democracy and human rights. As you mentioned in the introduction, I also was able to organize what we call the first, well, at that point, the second summit of democracy defenders, which means in the grassroots movements in countries where there is no democracy or is lack of democracy, there is also a lot of population fighting to get more democracy. And one of the conclusions we reached in that summit, which was interesting, is that we don't hear, we don't see people protesting to get more less rights, or to be more oppressed, or to be less free. It's the opposite. We see protests of people who wants to have more freedoms, to enjoy more rights, and that gives us hope. The fact that there are people who are, even in this pandemic, willing to go outside and protest and say we need more freedoms, it also gives us hope that authoritarianism will not be able to expand and to actually be the rule in the world.
Absolutely, sir. So there is one question from the participants. The participant has asked, how could small democratic countries influence the world power when countries like China and Russia is continuously ignoring democracy, human rights, and world order?
Excellent question. And again, it's very important. There is no, at the international community, I believe that there's no small or big country. Of course, they are more economically developed or more industrialized, but at the same time, they all have the same vote at the Human Rights Council. They have the same vote at the UN level. So what can small countries can do? Of course, you could work as first in coalitions. That's one answer to that. Work with other countries, build a stronger coalition. So if it's not the same when you're one country, that rather than having 100 countries or more supporting the view of protecting democracy. And in the case of at the same time, I can give you an example of a small country, let's say Lithuania, which is a small country in the European Union. They actually been very strong and very vocal against Russia and China's actions against human rights at the Human Rights Council, at the UN, and they even strengthened relations with countries like Taiwan or different democratic movements of Belarus, for instance. They support the Belarusian democratic forces there. Also to show that they, even though they're a small country, they want to demonstrate that they really want to protect these rights. In terms of Russia and China, what they can do, of course, it's all about this two-track policy that has been right now in place, which is diplomacy and deterrent. In terms of diplomacy, it means that it's important to have a channel of dialogue with these countries to explain to them the advantages of living in a democratic system. You can trade with other countries, you can be part of a community, that rather than taking the path of authoritarianism, that definitely is going to affect their economy, is going to affect the way of living. That's one approach. The other approach is deterrent, and deterrent is, of course, building these coalitions. That's why NATO alliance is doing. That's what the US, Canada, and the UK are also building that coalition. We see in the Indo-Pacific with India, Japan, Australia, uniting forces in the Indo-Pacific, trying to show strength in order to avoid China getting more involved in that area. So that's two things that they could definitely do. I hope I answered the question.
Absolutely, Professor. So there is an observation and a question both in one sentence that I have. One of the observations that we see as students and professors of international law and human rights is we all are always intrigued by the positions of what is happening in the European Union, particularly the position of the European Court of Human Rights, the ECTHR. And I had been reading that the Hungary, Poland, and Slovenia have had a democratic decline in their particular territory, in their particular country. So what do you think, how ECHR is playing the role of protecting the democracy, protecting the human rights, and seeing that we do not move towards the rise of authoritarianism?
Excellent question again. Very, very good question, and very to the point right now, because those countries that you name, actually, one of them, Hungary, was not even invited to the Summit of Democracy. Trying to, was very important point made by the US, saying that they are in a path of authoritarianism so far that they don't even consider them a democracy anymore, which is very difficult for the European Union to deal with, because of course, if you are part of the club of the 27 member states, you need to respect very fundamental rights that are part of the Lisbon Treaty, which include the fundamental Charter of Rights of European citizens, which are very important part of the whole European Union. And so that's what the court is involved. At the European Union level, you have different systems to try to promote, but also to protect rights and freedoms, and especially in human rights. And you have something called the European Commission. And the European Commission has what they call a director general, or a commissioner, actually, in terms of justice. And that commissioner actually triggered an entire procedure against Poland and Hungary, those two countries particularly, procedure where it imposed sanctions. It means mostly financial sanctions if they continue not following or not protecting enough basic human rights. At the same time, when these sanctions are not enough, that's when you go to the court system. And that's what the European Court of Justice comes in. And that the court actually can impose a decision, trigger a decision that makes the countries, in case of Poland and Hungary, to really stop or revoke rules, or actually, it pretty much it's like a Supreme Court. When it makes a decision, then you need to follow it. And then this has been the case. In the case of Slovenia, there have been more diplomatic talks with them, particularly with the president of Slovenia. There have been more talks to try to avoid going to that path that they have been taking in the case of Hungary and Poland. And so far, we've seen that it's been effective. Poland is changing their behavior. There's been certain setbacks, but it's also been certain improvements. They have been actually taking consideration the court decision, and they actually put it into place. The same thing from Hungary. And there is elections coming very, very soon in both countries. And that's what everyone is just expecting, that democratic elections, free and fair elections, will change the leaders of those countries, and then they will go back again to the path of democracy. So I hope I answered that question.
Yes, absolutely, Professor. One of the last few questions is from the participants, who asks that as US sanctions helps China in increasing its influence over the countries like Iran, Russia, how the world can deal with such situation?
Excellent question again. Really, really good question so far. A very difficult one, of course. Sanctions is a very interesting topic, because for some people it's very important, or at least for some commentators and some academics, they believe that sanctions is a good way of changing the behavior of authoritarians. When you put sanctions, individual sanctions to them, they feel threatened, and they might negotiate a solution. And that's the main idea behind sanctions. But however, in the recent years, authoritarians have learned how to deal with sanctions, not only individual sanctions, but economic sanctions. And that's why we see, for instance, countries like Iran supporting or getting support by Russia, or getting support from Venezuela, or from Cuba, countries where you have a dictator, but because if by being isolated by the world, cannot trade with any other country, the only way they can survive or maintain power is to get support from another authoritarian country that can give them resources, can provide trade. So that's something that we're seeing now, which is unprecedented. And that's why sanctions now, it needs to be revised, and then it needs to be more creative in the way of using it. Other argument could be that they are not useful anymore, that sanctions cannot really be useful, because authoritarians use it as an argument to say, look, they are actually attacking the population. This is their way of attacking us. So it could be actually counterproductive. What can we do? What could be a best approach? Something that they use here, an analogy that they use here in Brussels, is called the carrot and the stick. So sometimes they say, well, not necessarily sanctions can work as a stick to say, no, you're misbehaving, here is a stick, is a sanction, but also a carrot, which means giving more pretty much arguments to change their behavior based on providing them with aid, providing them with scholarships to the population, helping the population progress. So to give you a more specific example, in the case of Belarus, the population of Belarus are living under the dictatorship of Lukashenko, and Lukashenko is being supported by the Russian Vladimir Putin government. So what the European Union has done is actually offer a package of more than 30 billion euros, put it into the hands of the democratic forces in Belarus, and saying, if there is a change of behavior in Belarus, if the people actually, the military particularly, decide to change guards and say, look, we're not going to support any longer the dictator and we want to have free and fair elections, there is a package of $30 billion euros ready to support rebuilding Belarus. So this could be another option rather than using sanctions, which also another argument is that sanctions unite the authoritarians because they feel threatened by the sanctions, and so they look for coalitions between them and actually create unity between them. So rather than using sanctions, perhaps another approach could be providing aid, supporting the civil society in those countries in order to change the behavior of the society, and perhaps that could flourish democracy in those countries.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor, for this wonderful and insightful session. I'm sure the learners and the students and the professors alike would have extremely benefited from the same. And with such wonderful topics like human rights and democracy, it will open more windows to research and intellectual discussions. Thank you very much on behalf of Institute of Law, Nirma University.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm looking forward to be there as soon as the pandemic ease a little bit more. Then I hope to fly and visit you and meeting you, all of you, in person.
Thank you so much, Professor Nelson. It was a pleasure listening to you.
It was really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward for the next month's international education and be there.
Thank you so much. Definitely, we would love to host you on the campus.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.